Hello, my name is Reggie Chapman. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Director of Policy at the Fortune Society's David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bar, which is a discussion driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the system. Here we discuss critical questions about how the system works, its interactions with social justice, and the efforts that advocates are making to improve the lives of everyone affected. We ask that you, the viewers, to spread the word about both sides of the bars and share your comments with us on Twitter, also known as X at the Fortune SOC. Today's show is titled Top Trends in Criminal Legal System Reform in 2024. Our guest for today's show is Nicole D. Parker, who is the Senior Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project. Nicole manages the organization's state and local advocacy efforts on sentencing reform, voting rights, and confronting racial disparities in the criminal legal system. Since joining the organization in 2009, Nicole's advocacy and findings have supported criminal legal reform in several states. Her areas of expertise include research and grassroots support around challenging racial disparities, felony disenfranchisement, as well as prison closures and prison reuse. She has authored reports highlighting ballot access for people detained in jails, state prison closures, and declining prison populations, as well as articles on the collateral impacts of justice involvement on communities of color and how current social movements are challenging mass incarceration. The Essence magazine also named Nicole a new civil rights leader for her work in challenging mass incarceration. During this episode, we will speak with Nicole and we will look back at 2024 and explore the key changes that formerly incarcerated activists, lawmakers, and advocates took to challenge mass incarceration. We will also examine the lack of process or lack thereof that advocates have made in continuing to expand voting rights, decarcerate, and close prisons, as well as what we can expect to see going forward. Now I'll introduce Nicole to you.
Thank you so much, Reggie.
So now that we have Nicole here, so let's begin. Good afternoon, Nicole. It's a pleasure to speak with you. We have honored to have you here on both sides of the bars, and you have a very impressive resume. And so we look
Okay.
forward to having you provide us with your insight concerning today's topics.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's a pleasure for us to have you as well. Uh, so, the first thing we would like to discuss with you are the key changes in 2024. So, over the past several years, a combination of incarcerated activists, lawmakers, and advocates have challenged mass incarceration. And so, my question is, what are some of the key strategies that they used in doing so?
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. It's great to have this conversation. It's hard to believe that we are coming up on the end of the year. And so throughout the year, I do track trends and also participate in efforts to challenge mass incarceration through advocacy and policy reform. So far this year, there have been a handful of reforms that have made their way through the legislative process. My office has been involved in a sentencing reform effort that was adopted in Oklahoma that passed what we call second look and allowed people whose underlying crime was a result or a contributing factor was domestic violence to petition for resentencing before the courts in Oklahoma. So that cleared the legislative hurdles and is now a part of the sentencing framework in Oklahoma. And other states are looking at second look reforms around the country as well. There's also been reforms adopted for collateral consequences, particularly the restoration of voting rights for people with felony convictions in the state of Nebraska. The post sentence completion waiting period of 2 years was repealed earlier this year, allowing some 7,000 Nebraskans with felony convictions to participate in the franchise in the general election last week. Also on the ballot were several criminal legal reform measures. Unfortunately, many of them were not progressive, they were regressive, and we can get into that. But there were some progressive reforms in Nevada. That state, voters in that state banned prison prison slavery by ballot measure in the state of Nevada. And then also in Nebraska, medical marijuana was authorized through ballot measure last week. So those are some of the good things. But Reggie, I will let you know that there were also bad reforms passed by ballot measure last week. And earlier in the year, there were regressive reforms passed through the legislature in states like Louisiana. So this year, there's definitely been mixed results when it comes to when it comes to changes in criminal legal policy. And so I think we should talk about the atmosphere that progressive coalitions are working within, what that means for potential reform going forward, and sort of what we're up against in trying to challenge mass incarceration, given the continued scale of high rates of incarceration in the United States.
Okay. So you said a lot of the things that I actually had interest in. Several things you spoke about or concerning voting rights and the atmosphere concerning that. So and that's something very important I want to discuss. So I want to kind of circle back to your statements about voting rights and kind of like re state the question actually again. So hopefully you can give us a little bit more detail concerning that. So again, the set of questions concern voting rights, and as you just stated, over the past several years, several states did expand voting rights to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. And I want you to expound on that possibly. And my question for you is that have states continued to pass these type of voting rights in 2024? And if so,
They
what are the
have.
benefits? And if not, so if so, what are the benefits? And if not, what are the collateral consequences of states that didn't do that?
Sure. No, states did expand voting rights this year. I mentioned Nebraska. So since 1997, we've counted that 26 states in the District of Columbia have expanded voting rights over nearly a 30-year period, restoring voting rights to about 2 million residents with felony conviction histories, about 2 million citizens with felony conviction histories. That said, there were still 4 million people in the 24 general election who were unable to vote because of a felony conviction. Many of those people were in prison and jail, but the majority of people who were disenfranchised due to a felony conviction, 7 out of 10 of the 4 million who were disenfranchised were actually in the community and were not incarcerated. They were, as you know, on paper, on felony probation or parole. And in some states like Florida, Kentucky, and Virginia, they were post sentence. And so there's hundreds of thousands of residents in those states who remain disenfranchised even though they've completed their sentence. That is even though Florida expanded voting rights to over 1 million people in 2018, when via ballot measure, a majority of Floridians voted to end lifetime disenfranchisement in that state. And in other states, since Florida's ballot measure passed 6 years ago, states like Minnesota, New Mexico, New York, with parole voting rights being expanded to people on parole in New York in 2021, and also in California in the same year, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals have gotten their voting rights back over a 6-year period, particularly with the state of Florida sort of helping to tip the scales in the rights restoration reform direction with the passage of a ballot measure in 2018. That said, as I've mentioned, there's continues to be millions of people who are disenfranchised. And so there's a lot more work to do. We need to end felony disenfranchisement, go back to Florida, allow people to vote who are in the community on supervision on felony parole and probation. In other states, there remain hundreds of thousands of residents disenfranchised who are on supervision. Those include the states of Georgia and Texas, states that were dominated the electoral conversation this season. So there's a lot of work to do on rights restoration, a lot of work to do on making sure that people have their voice heard in the democratic process, and to understand that people don't lose their citizenship just because they are involved with the criminal legal system, just because they might be incarcerated. And in fact, there are a handful of jurisdictions in the United States, Maine, Vermont, Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, where people can vote even when sentenced to prison, regardless of the crime of conviction. And so, and that policy, that practice should be in effect throughout the United States. So in all states, nobody should ever lose their right to vote, even when they're in prison.
Thank you. Thank you for that information. It's very powerful, and we appreciate that. And I guess what we can gather from what you said is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, we've made some progress, but there's definitely much more work to do.
That is a finer way to say that. Absolutely, Reggie.
We appreciate you. My next set of questions concerns decarceration trends. So again, over the past several years, we've seen policies that have led to the reduction in incarceration rates. And so my question for you is that, based on your observation, have states and local governments continued to pass these type of policies that have led to the reduction in incarceration rates?
There have been some changes that have contributed to that were passed with the spirit of decarceration. So I mentioned earlier the state of Oklahoma has passed a post incarceration sentencing review called Second Look, where people who can petition for second look resentencing before the courts in that state if they have domestic violence, if they have a history of domestic violence. Those second look reforms have passed in other states. People with who are chronically ill or who have medical, chronic medical conditions can petition for parole or can petition for second look resentencing because of recent changes in Michigan. Other jurisdictions are examining and considering second look resentencing practices and policies. Other states have worked to change what might send somebody to prison, so offer and expand alternatives to prison for prison bound defendants for certain felony and drug offenses. That includes the state of New York and New Jersey, states that have been at the top of a list of states that have successfully reduced their prison populations. And in New York, there's been a number of prisons that have closed down because of the decline in prison population. So those realities in the state prison system and in the number of people who are incarcerated has been helpful, but there's still much more work to do given the scale of incarceration, not just in New York and New Jersey, but around the country. And, I would say that there have been years when the winds of reform were really strong. I would say that in 2024, as we think about what's possible in 2025, it's really more of a mixed bag in terms of what's possible and what has been passing. Earlier this year, there were very much regressive policies passed in the state of Louisiana that ended parole for certain offenses in that state. And just last week, with several ballot measures that were adopted, there were a hardening of certain penalties for certain criminal convictions in states like Arizona, Colorado, and California. So it seems like 2024 is a year where anti decarceration has been a part of the conversation. And it's something for us to pay attention to because it might be a signal for what's possible in 2025 and what coalitions and organizers and advocates need to be focused on going into next year.
Wow. Again, that is very, very interesting. Again, just to kind of echo some of the sentiments from the previous set of questions, we've made some progress, but in this instance, there's definitely much more work to do. And some of the things you just spoke about are very, very concerning when you mentioned, paraphrasing you, right, about this window of opportunity, um, and this idea that like there's been some pushback. There's a lot of information. Can you elaborate on that just a bit? Because I think that's something that our listeners should be aware of. You mentioned about this window of opportunity, and you also mentioned about like what coalitions and advocacies groups should be doing going forward in respect to that window closing and or not closing.
Yeah, I mean, let's take what happened during the general election last week and the fact that in a handful of states there were ballot measures that strengthened criminal penalties for certain offenses. So, in the state of California, this ballot measure, Proposition 36, passed with overwhelming support because California voters approved it with over 70% support and reclassified certain property and drug misdemeanors as felony offenses following reports on increases in property theft and increases in drug use given concerns in crime. And that follows a 10-year window where in 2014, a ballot measure passed to reclassify felonies as misdemeanors with the goal of decarcerating the California state prison system and contributed to reductions in the state prison system in California. And so within 10 years, the winds of reform have changed so much that last week, 70% of California voters voted in the opposite direction towards more severe penalties for the types of offenses that were reclassified towards a decarceration approach 10 years ago. Similarly, in Colorado and in Arizona, stiffer penalties were adopted via ballot measure on the general election ballot last Tuesday when voters in both states approved sentencing measures that increase sentence lengths for certain offenses in those states. The predictions are that those ballot measures will help contribute to a growth in the state prison populations in Colorado and Arizona. We'll see if those predictions prove correct. But regardless of what the future prison population counts ends up being, we know that in 2024, voters in Colorado, in Arizona, in California voted to enhance penalties when the question was posed on the ballot, signaling a more tougher approach to crime in spite of the years of reform, in spite of years of calling attention to the policies and practices that contribute to the high rate of incarceration in the United States and trying to call attention to the crisis of mass incarceration in the United States.
Wow, wow. That's very, again, very, very concerning. And I mean, you said a lot, but and all of which is very important. However, the two things that you spoke about that I think is very, very important for our listeners, you mentioned ballot measures as I believe to be the mechanisms for which they're doing. They're kind of like going against what have previously done, and you mentioned this idea of winds of reform. So again, and I think that's important for our viewers and our listeners to understand the importance of ballot measures. I just want to know, can you just speak to how important ballot measures are? I know in New York State, we just recently in our local elections had ballot measures that were placed on the ballots. And I don't think that very many people knew the importance of them. So can you kind of just like inform our audience of the importance of ballot measures, how to be aware of them? And because I have a lot to say about this and I apologize. My second question is that what do you think is driving what you call these winds of reform?
Well, ballot measures are not possible in every state. I think less than half the states policy can be adopted via ballot measure, but they are a mechanism to change policy either progressively or regressively if it can't be done via the legislature. So in some states, ballot measures are a real important mechanism to change policy, particularly progressively. We saw a progressive outcome for ballot measure in Florida with the adoption of Amendment 4 in 2018 that ended lifetime disenfranchisement. Prior to the adoption of Amendment 4 in 2018 in Florida, for many years prior to that, there had been efforts to change and expand voting rights through the legislature, and that just didn't happen. So there was a lot of organizing that went into changing the law and expanding voting rights via ballot measure in that state. That said, as you know, I've touched on already in Arizona, California, Colorado, the questions aren't always progressive ones, particularly in calling attention to the problem of mass incarceration. They can also contribute to what some call criminal justice populism, sort of a popular vote outcome on criminal policy, on criminal legal policy, and can result in the stiffening of penalties via popular reform, via popular ballot measure outcomes. And that's what's happened in 24 in California, Colorado, and Arizona, and what's already been touched on. In terms of shaping these windows of reform, pushing open the conversation and challenging mass incarceration, calling attention to the problem, of high levels of incarceration and trying to address the policies and practices that contribute to it. I think there's a lot of ways to do that. Much of that has to happen within communities in terms of people directly impacted by these practices, talking about how they've lived through the experiences and what the implications of the policies are on themselves and their families and their communities. I mean, one way I came to this work is because of incarceration in my family and understanding the harms of incarceration in my family and in my community. And I think that politicization, that motivation by the witnessing of injustice due to high rates of incarceration, how high rates of incarceration can and do affect entire communities, drives a lot of people, motivates a lot of people to participate in conversations, to challenge the policies that contribute to high rates of incarceration, challenge the policies that might disappear people from their families, from their communities, behind too long prison terms, behind civil rights disqualifications because of collateral consequences, not just the stripping of voting rights, but legalized discrimination when it comes to housing and employment. All of those experiences for people who directly experiencing them because of their own felony conviction, lived experience, or family members who witness and experience the collateral impacts of incarceration, that can help motivate and drive people to participate in coalition efforts, to share their own stories, to lobby, to challenge, to demand new approaches. And I think that has helped to contribute to windows of change, windows of reform. And there's been successes over the time, there's been successes over the years, but in 2024, there's definitely a mixed atmosphere given what happened in the general election and given how the year is ending up.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I had a set of questions concerning the general election and some of the positive things we can kind of do going forward to address these, but you were ahead of it. So you kind of answered those questions. And so with that being said, I guess I'll try to surmise it, which is that essentially what I think you were saying was that, in order for us to, change these wins and to, address the issues while the windows are open is about at the community level, organizing families and friends and people that are impacted by these policies negatively to become active, to become informed, to rally around each other, and to get active in policies and procedures. Thank you for that. And so, in spite of some of the negative things that may have transpired in 2024, I think that that what you just spoke about are some of the positive things we can look to going forward. And we're kind of up against time. I have just one question. Maybe you can give me a line about concerning like have states continue to pass policies concerning prison closures?
There are prison closures that have been a part of state legislative discussions this year, and prisons that are scheduled for closure and have already closed in 24. So it's interesting, and it's a part of the ongoing dynamic that prisons can close even during a time when there are anti-decarceration efforts that are a part of the conversation. California is a perfect example. There have been prisons that have closed in California this year, led by the state legislature and the governor's office, in spite of the fact that the majority of California voters last week voted for anti-decarceration efforts through the enhancement of sentences via ballot measure in California. And other states that have closed prisons this year include Illinois and Virginia. So even though we are in an atmosphere of mixed results when it comes to decarceration, there have been prison closures in some states this year.
Thank you, thank you, thank you for providing us with that insight. I think we were able to. Thank you for providing us with an assortment of information. Thank you for unpacking the nuances and basically informing the population, informing our listeners. And going forward, we really appreciate you. And so, just to close things out, I want to speak to our guests. I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom and experience. To the viewers, I thank you for joining us for all of your thoughts provoking discussion. In the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you so much for tuning in to both sides of the bars. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on our website, fortunesociety.org. That's fortunasociety.org, or Facebook by typing in Fortune Society. This is Reggie Chapman, and I appreciate you for joining us and for having a critical conversation on both sides of the bars. Again, thank you, Nicole, for providing us your wisdom and your insight, and we appreciate it from everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie. Appreciate it.
If you want to know how to reduce crime in America, in New York City, you do it one person at a time, creating an environment that celebrates the human spirit. Recidivism is a result of societal failure to do that, and Fortune has demonstrated that lives can change.
I tell people all the time, this is where I grew up. This is where I learned what being a man is and what being a productive citizen means.
It is the work of this great organization that has helped to shape my ideas, drive my conviction, and further deepen my commitment to the cause.
For more than half a century, you have amplified the voices of those who are impacted by unfair policies and helped thousands of justice-involved people transform their lives. You have led by example to show how we can help formerly incarcerated individuals come home, rebuild their lives, and contribute to our communities.
It's never about the contract or the milestones first. It's always about the individual. These individuals were literally suffering in incarceration because they just didn't have an address to go to. And for them to walk into a place where it's about them and only them and what they need and only what they need.
There's one person in particular, he came through our programs and he ended up opening his own construction company, and he came back to Fortune and said, I want to hire people from here, and it was like about how if you lift one person up, they lift others. Even if it's just one person that this happens to, it's worth it. And I know that it's not just one person, it's many people.
COVID-19 worsened existing barriers to reentry. Reentry is hard enough as is, but even harder during a pandemic. As people were released from Rikers early due to COVID-19, our services and housing were needed even more.